it been days? Had it been weeks? Had it been longer? In total darkness, sodden with sweat from the roaring heat, and barely the energy to stay upright, this journey in the hold could cost you your life, as it had done so many around you. Yet, should you survive, the only thing waiting for you on land was hard labor under the watch of the Imperial Japanese forces. From 1942, Japan would use freighter and cargo ships to transport Allied POWs to its territories to be put to hard labor. However, Allied POWs in the ship's hold faced every threat to their life imaginable, from delirium to dehydration, from starvation to suffocation, and most tragically, attacks from their own Allied forces. Welcome to History on Fleek. Today we examine the horrific fate of POWs aboard Japanese hell ships. Prisoner of war stories are some of the most brutal any conflict has to offer. World War II marks history with its staggering tales of inhumane treatment of captured persons in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. Of the latter, the Imperial Japanese Army's hell ships are perhaps the worst the entire conflict has to offer. These ships were typically cargo vessels or once transport ships that had been repurposed to transport prisoners of war. In a disturbing turn of circumstances, these ships would carry a mix of cargo, Japanese soldiers, and POWs, meaning that the ships could not be registered as non-combatant vessels. Therefore, ships often loaded with Allied prisoners of war were targets for Allied aircraft and submarines. Tragically, over 20,000 Allied prisoners of war would die at sea from their own forces' gunfire. Japanese hell ships began their prisoner of war transfers by sea in May of 1942. Along with Asian forced slave laborers, these POWs were taken to Japanese islands including Burma, Siam, Moluccas, and Sumatra to be used for forced labor. The term hell ship is born from the extremely inhumane conditions the POWs were kept in and the cruelty of the crew. Journeys on the hell ships would last weeks, and during this time, POWs would suffer a profound deprivation of their most basic needs. Many would not survive the journey. The Arisan Maru was a near 7,000-ton freighter repurposed for use as a hell ship. Built in 1944, the vessel was used as a transport for soldiers in its initial voyages before being used as a prisoner of war transport. In arguably its most infamous journey, the Maru would depart from Manila on October 11, 1944, with some 1,782 Allied POWs. A fast evacuation from the Philippines was required as Allied forces conducted air raids. As a result, many times more people were loaded into the hold than it could reasonably contain. 5-gallon cans were given to each POW, and many suffering from dysentery would quickly overflow these, in a hold that would reach 49 degrees Celsius in temperature. POWs suffered these astonishingly unsanitary conditions with a lack of water. The final voyage of the Arisan Maru would take place on October 24, 1944. At approximately 5 p.m., the number 3 hold was struck by a torpedo from the USS Shark. Remarkably, no POWs were killed by the torpedo strikes, and all were able to escape the ship's hold. However, the Japanese made no effort to rescue their mutinied POWs, only the Japanese who had jumped overboard. Of an over 1,700 Allied POW haul, a mere 9 would survive the sinking. From 1942, Imperial Japan would use 134 transports as hell ships. These ships would make over 156 voyages and transport a staggering 120,000 or so Allied prisoners of war. Yet these hell ships symbolize such a visceral account of the futility of war. Some 14 of the hell ships were sunk by the U.S. Navy and British Royal Navy fleet. In each instance, there are at least 500 Allied prisoners of war on board the ships, and in several instances, like the Suez Maru, there were no survivors. In what may be the most wasteful of all instances, the 1,000 survivors of the Oryoku Maru sinking were loaded onto the Inura Maru, which itself was later bombed and sunk, killing hundreds of Allied prisoners. The number one cause of Allied POW deaths on board hell ships was not the cruelty of guards, the unbelievable conditions, or deprivation. It was Allied attacks on the hell ships. Just one detail, just one matter, that these ships were marked for Japanese cargo to aid their war effort. made a world of life-costing difference. This single detail would lead to countless tragic instances of the Allies taking the lives of their own, with no grasp of the fact at the time. The Oryoku Maru stands as a dark example of the very worst conditions and outcomes a hell ship had in store. The passenger cargo ship was repurposed as a soldier transport and POW transport by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Like many of these unfathomably marked transports, it would meet its fate by sinking in December of 1944. On board were over 1,500 Allied prisoners of war, including Americans, Czechs, Dutch, British, and Norwegians, among many other nationalities. Also on board were close to 2,000 Japanese military personnel and civilians above board. Having departed Manila on December 13th, U.S. Navy aircraft fired upon the vessel as it approached the naval base in Subic Bay. On the 15th of December, the Oryoku Maru would sink, but not before absolute carnage unfolded with the 3,000-strong passenger list attempting escape. Nearly 300 died aboard, many dying from suffocation or dehydration. Many had their lives taken by the Allied attack itself. Many would be drowned while attempting to escape, and others were shot for even attempting. Over 500 Allied POWs would die as a result of the unfolding chaos. Yet disturbingly, it isn't even the escape and sinking that holds the most unsettling story of the Oryoku Maru. A colonel's on-board report describes a picture of the ship's hold befitting of the term hell ship. It describes POWs completely bereft of their sanity, surrounded by nothing but darkness, attempting to murder fellow prisoners and in some instances, attempting to drink their blood. So grim were the conditions in the ship's hold. Many POWs were granted the sweet release of death when the Oryoku Maru sank on December 15, 1944. As with any wartime atrocity, the light of day would soon be shone on the horrors of the past. Many of the scores of hell ships have memorials standing to this day. The lives they cost and the trauma they brought are not forgotten. The Japanese government had publicly apologized for the treatment suffered by Allied prisoners of war on board the hell ships. Yet, several survivors and their families are left wanting reparations to this day. The two most prominent strands of suffering by POWs aboard hell ships were the living conditions and the treatment from guards and crew. Accounts of survivors are clear in expressing the brutality of Japanese guards on the hell ships, with many seemingly taking pleasure in the suffering of the prisoners under their control. Following the war, many Japanese officers and guards responsible were tried and convicted of war crimes for their actions. Of the Oryoku Maru crew, the guard commandant of the ship, Junasoburo Toshino, was found guilty of the supervision and murder of around 16 men and was sentenced to death. The guard's interpreter, Shusuke Wada, faced similar charges, found guilty of neglecting to follow orders for adequate quarters, food, and water for POWs. This caused the death of numerous Allied prisoners of war, and Wada was sentenced to life imprisonment and hard labor. Multiple guards on board also received substantial prison sentences, yet interestingly enough, ship captain Shin Kajiyama was acquitted. Being in a barely converted cargo transport, there was no consideration for the human beings on board. All POWs were quite simply crammed into the holds of the ships. Numerous accounts give a picture of hundreds of people packed together with no room to move in a space with hardly any air or ventilation. Alongside this, POWs on board were subjected to acute neglect from the crew. Extremes of temperature, be it heat or cold, and an ongoing lack of sanitation were suffered through. Dehydration was a common outcome. POWs were given hardly any food or water, and many resorted to drinking seawater, which only exacerbated illness and dehydration. With air, water, and space all in shockingly low supply, many would die from inevitable turns of dysentery, starvation, and asphyxia. On a journey that would last weeks, prisoners would often fall into delirium, becoming unresponsive and nonverbal from the utmost deprivations. As if the mortality of these POWs was not imperiled enough, abject cruelty from the ship's crew was routinely exhibited. Prisoners in the ship's hold could be subject to punishment through forced standing or kneeling for hours on end, as well as physical punishment through electricity or beatings. One cannot begin to imagine the ordeal these people were facing, and many would try to escape by jumping overboard or escaping the holds. These prisoners were usually recaptured and faced even more punishment for their efforts. So extreme was this ordeal that death was abound for hundreds of prisoners who would not survive the journey. Somehow, for many, the human spirit would hold them through. Many Allied POWs formed bonds in the ship's holds, and these crisis-born relationships would help them survive against all odds. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.